I'll be talking today about wildlife tourism and its impact on animal welfare and conservation, as well as specifically sustainable wildlife tourism. So that's what is meant by this conservation, welfare, sustainability nexus, basically the interaction of all these components, which is severely understudied. Is there anyone here that is hoping to focus on wild animals as a veterinarian? Maybe, yeah. Okay, that's awesome. So yeah, happy to answer questions. And yeah, one of the literature gaps that I identified when I started my PhD was a lack of understanding of how we study wild animal welfare. Like there's huge gaps in the research, which I'll talk more about, but it's difficult sometimes to convince folks that don't work with wild animals or in animal welfare how welfare influences the conservation of wild animals, and how, I'm sure many of us understand that like animal welfare relates to their biological functioning in the ecosystem, but those elements aren't really broadly understood, and I still will have, when I'm trying to publish, anonymous like peer reviewers write back saying, oh, conservation and welfare are not connected at all. And I'm just like, I don't understand how, because conservation and species are made up of individuals, and the welfare of the individuals influences the welfare of the group of the species and if they can survive or whether they'll go extinct. So it's surprising how high-reaching a lot of this like misunderstanding is. So to outline what I'll be going through today, I've got the scholarly grounding of my research, which is very interdisciplinary. And then I'll talk about the three major themes that I see as being the trouble with wildlife tourism writ large. And keep in mind, like for the majority of this presentation, I'm not talking about like accredited zoos. I'm talking more about like the vast majority of wildlife tourism, which is unaccredited captive attractions. And then I'll get into how I see bringing animals into sustainable wildlife tourism. So that bringing animals in is a phrase that comes from animal geography. Basically, you look at how animals are influenced, the lives of animals are influenced by different like societal structures, cultural values, how we place them literally in place and how we think about them. So both literal and metaphorical placement of animals. And so that's really the grounding of my research. And then I brought to it also my background in zoology and animal welfare and conservation as well. And then we'll look at the case study that I did for my PhD and my postdoc, which was monkeys in Costa Rican sanctuary tourism. Has anyone been to Costa Rica? Okay, amazing, great. And then we'll end with closing thoughts. So as I mentioned, these were the kind of broad themes of my PhD research. So even though my fieldwork focused on animal welfare and conservation in Costa Rica, the approach I took to it was how tourism studies, broadly speaking, are trending towards recognizing animals as being co-creators of the tourism experience. So moving away from that like utilitarian mindset of animals as like a mere resource, but more so like a participant, a co-participant, a co-creator of a tourism attraction. And this is a way that tourism studies is increasingly embracing like ethical relations with wild animals and a care-based approach. Animal geographies, as I mentioned, is like all of these kind of disciplines are related. So this looks at animals as having agency, which is a given, but surprisingly quite radical for a lot of animal disciplines. But yeah, sees animals as having agency, subjectivity, their interest in self-determination, and animal welfare protocols more generally are starting to reflect that more, because we're trying to push for studying and finding ways to create positive lives for animals in captivity as opposed to just reducing negative interactions and negative states. And animal geography also views most of the world as being a multi-species landscape, not just like humans and then the rest of the environment and then animals. This article, special issue, came out in National Geographic about the unseen suffering and the hidden cost of wildlife tourism. And it was a photojournalism expose where the author went to multiple countries around the world such as like Thailand, Russia, I think South Africa as well, and they investigated the wildlife tourism realities there and photographed it. And these are like, it's really hard to look at the photos, so I've tried for most of this presentation to pick like moderately digestible ones that aren't gravely disturbing, but there's a lot that they uncovered, and this also kind of piggybacked with research coming out of Wild Crew at Oxford University, investigating into the lives of animals in the broad scope of wildlife tourism writ large, which are, as I said, unaccredited attractions. And the 500,000 or more animals around the world that are at these captive attractions that aren't really documented necessarily. I don't know if it's common knowledge because it wasn't to me when I started studying wildlife tourism, but there isn't any global regulation at all, which is partly why we have like 50 terrible roadside zoos in Ontario, as well as like a world-class Toronto Zoo. There's no global regulation. There's all these different zoological accrediting bodies, and the majority of attractions often can be these kind of hybrid things where you go to a circus or you go to some attraction in a different country, and then, oh, there happens to be like a performing monkey, or it could literally be someone coming up to you on the street with a wild animal. So it's really hard to study wildlife tourism in these more like non-traditional contexts, but it does represent the majority. So one of the major issues with wildlife tourism are the prevalence of unethical and unsustainable practices. The tourism industry is like one of the largest industries in the world, and ironically, the illegal wildlife trade is like the 4th largest illegal industry in the world, and those also very much intersect. So tourism worldwide for zoos and aquaria attract 700 million tourists a year, representing over 800,000 animals, thousands of species, and this is in accredited sites. And half of these sites are nonprofit, and as we know, it's very difficult to manage human interest in profit with animal welfare interests in being a self-determining animal living a good life. Around 7,000 to 10,000 public wildlife collections are documented around the world. I'm sure there's many more that aren't. And of that, 238 are accredited by the American Zoological Association, AZA, and the EAZA. Those have really great standards, but like the World Association for Zoos and Aquarium, which has way more members, a study was done where they found like 75% of zoos accredited by them allowed like human-animal interaction, which goes against best practices in most contexts. So even accreditation you have to kind of take with a grain of salt. And there's only 200 Global Federation of Animal Sanctuaries. And those are sites that don't allow captive breeding of wildlife, and captivity don't allow like human-animal interaction, so that's how they're differentiated. And so there's way more unaccredited animal attractions worldwide, and we know that there's at least 500,000 wild animals in attractions worldwide that are endangering their welfare and conservation. Because these researchers looked at 24 types of wildlife tourism around the world. So here are examples, and they graded them on a scale of like negative to positive welfare and conservation. And this was not done in person because they looked at literally thousands of attractions worldwide. They did this called like a desk audit. They did this from what existed online about these places. And so they set kind of like the bar for like great animal welfare was meeting, I think, 4 to 5 of the 5 freedoms of animal welfare, for example. And what they found was that all of these types of attractions had negative impacts except for wildlife sanctuaries here. So I think it was like bear sanctuary, like elephant sanctuary, lion sanctuary. So this is basically the like seed for my PhD, where I said, like, what is it about sanctuaries that is potentially providing good welfare and conservation, and what are they doing differently? And there's very, very little published on wildlife sanctuaries because people define it so many different ways. So when we talk about the interaction of animal conservation, welfare, and sustainability in wildlife tourism, we can see on the less sustainable side, you're going to trigger what's known as like an extinction vortex. So in the captive context, this could be like roadside zoos performing animals, using wildlife for like animal selfies as photo props. So if you're just extracting animals from their natural environment to use them in this way, logically they will eventually go extinct. And then with free-ranging wildlife, this could be like trophy hunting and fishing, food baiting for close encounters, which is like highly controversial in wildlife tourism, very context-based, right? Like if we bait bears, then they'll come into human settlements, but bears are already coming into human settlements to go through trash. So let's make a feeding area over here, and then, now people know where the bears are, they're gonna go hunt them. So there's like, it's extremely ethically complicated to feed animals for wildlife tourism purposes. And then on the more sustainable side, you have, in captive context, accredited zoos, aquariums, and sanctuaries. And as I'll show in my case study of Costa Rican sanctuaries, just because a place isn't accredited doesn't mean it's bad. My 3 focal sanctuaries were not accredited. Accreditation takes a lot of money, has a high standard. It can be inaccessible if you're from a country that doesn't speak English, that doesn't have a lot of funding. So it's, again, difficult to make kind of broad strokes about wildlife tourism. And then in a free-ranging wildlife context, viewing wildlife in reserves, parks, and conservation areas typically will be more sustainable. And so ideally, this is leading to a more resilient multi-species community. I alluded to the gap that exists in the study of wild animal welfare. Lots of gaps. Most animal welfare research to date, as you all know, focuses on domestic species, which, came from farming and companion species, which also makes sense because they're already often captive and easier to study in that way. And then most wild animal research comes from like zoo contexts and from laboratories specifically for monkeys, because I was learning about primate welfare. A lot of the research I looked at was lab monkeys, which is kind of hard to then figure out what's their behavior going to be like in the wild, because I had to create an ethogram, as I'll show you later. So there's very little known about wild animal welfare, generally speaking, and even less about sanctuary contexts. I think there was like a literature review of like over 1,000 papers on like wild animal welfare, and I think like only a few percentage was sanctuaries. And most of the research actually on wild animal welfare is theoretical. And there's also this taxa bias, because like me, people want to study like adorable mammals, and maybe no one cares about a skink or, I don't know, a toad or something like that. I care, but I too studied a charismatic species. And of course, people often want to study what is like causing negative welfare and suffering, as opposed to what's going to create positive welfare. Or one of my favorite ways of thinking about it, Vicky Melfi is a zoo welfare scientist. She says, how can we provide a luxurious life in captivity, as opposed to just like positive experiences? Like, what would luxury look like in captivity as like a precautionary stage so that we're reaching high? Now, the third thing that is wrong with wildlife tourism worldwide is animals are being othered, which again is bringing in that like social science scholarship there with the word othering, but this idea of like conceptualizing them as resources, whether that's through promotions, through their relationships with humans, using animals for wildlife selfies, greenwashing. Is anyone familiar with the term greenwashing or like humane washing? Maybe it's like making something appear ethical and sustainable that isn't. There is no global regulation of the term sustainable or eco, which is very challenging, because then trying to improve the lives of animals and environmental conditions in wildlife tourism context means that you're trying to change human behavior, which is probably the hardest thing to change in the world. So effectively, by positioning animals as resources at worst, or like passive participants and receivers of tourists at best, is extrinsically valuing them for their encounter value, or for even ecosystem services, which is often used as a positive thing. But it's like, maybe we can save this peccary not because it is a seed disperser, but because it deserves to have a home in the rainforest. So a lot of the social science and ethics that I brought into this research was kind of challenging those expectations of seeing animals as like, they must be useful to humans, they must be providing some sort of resource. So how do we bring wild animals into tourism? The ways I conceive of improving wildlife tourism include understanding the conservation, welfare, sustainability nexus, as we've been talking about it, as well as trying to pursue evidence-based and careful practices, meaning like care forward, caring about the individual, caring about them having a good life, and also seeing animals as being stakeholders. Animals are like rarely, if ever, given stakeholdership in decisions that concern their lives, which is stressful, but also kind of makes sense because in human context, Indigenous folks are often not given stakeholdership, right? So animals are often, there's other frontiers to reach, and animals are often not conceived of even having a voice. They're a resource or a number. But like, for example, like in the Netherlands, there's like multiple members of the animal political party that like sit in the cabinet, and they represent the interests of animals. So there are very real ways, and political scientists have come up with ways to kind of bring animals into the forums that we're in, part of which includes looking at their welfare and saying, well, their interest is positive welfare. So how would they, or maybe agency, do they have a right to exit a relationship with us or an encounter with us? So that's what's meant by animal stakeholdership. How can we expect the average person to figure these things out when even like the global organizations that are in charge of, that we're like putting trust in to have these ethical protocols aren't even saying animals matter, the welfare of animals matter. My case study of Costa Rican sanctuaries. So Costa Rica is the first country in the world to make it illegal to have animal selfies, and the first to like make this a national campaign, which is really cool. I think it came out in like 2020. I was doing field work there for my PhD in 2019, right before COVID. And then that's me. That's a capuchin in a sanctuary, and you can see tourists on the other side. And I was like studying the capuchin behavior as the tourists came and did like a tour group. And then the photo on the bottom is also of a sanctuary that is open to the public, but this section is the section that if you're the vet at this sanctuary, that's like your domain, chiefly because these are animals that are hoping to be reintroduced to the wild, and they are kept separate from the public. So basically in Costa Rica, a lot of these places call themselves sanctuaries, but they're legally either a zoo open to the public or a rescue center closed to the public. Most of the sites are both, because people are bringing them animals anyway, so they need to have a license to be a rescue center. Basically, you have this dual licensing. Most of these sanctuaries are nonprofit. At least the rescue center part has to be nonprofit. They can't profit off of them. And only one sanctuary I went to was actually owned by Costa Ricans. So most are foreign owned and expat run. So the aim of my fieldwork was to basically look at whether Costa Rican sanctuaries are sustainable based on my assumption that a truly sustainable attraction is going to give positive animal welfare and conservation outcomes. And so I was looking at all these different things I mentioned, like how are animals considered, like with like ethics of care, compassion, are best practices in place, and looking at even, I was interested also in how animals and monkeys are like also co-workers, because that kept coming up in interviews with tour guides. They're like, this monkey's my co-worker. So I was interested in that as well as like, okay, is that like a multi-species community approach to this? And so here's the 5 domains of animal welfare research. And like this came out, I mean, it had been developed, but again, like I was there in 2019. This is the 2020 version, but it's basically what I grounded my framework in. But I had all these adjectives on the side. It's collaborative, it's participatory. Like I went there and said, can I study your monkeys? And like a lot of places said no. A lot of places said no until they met me in person and I like actually showed up. And my research was transdisciplinary because I created a framework that Costa Rican sanctuaries can use to monitor their own animal welfare, and was created in conjunction with them. The methods were socio-ecological, talking to people, talking to the animals whether or not they wanted to hear me. This is the framework I created, just kind of showing the different categories and how they're all connected, which also looks like this. So my methods are at the top, like participant observation. Basically, I was like a fly on the wall at all these sanctuaries, behavioral observation of the monkeys and the tourists and the humans, but that's specifically like their ethology. Document review, interviewing people that worked, like the veterinarians, the staff, like interviewed anyone that had anything to do with the sanctuary, including the cleaning staff, because often they're the ones that know the monkeys the best. And I interviewed Costa Ricans, and then I did surveys of tourists to see what they were learning at the sanctuaries. This is the framework I made. How do the monkeys respond? Like, what's the clinical capacity? And all of this was like made in the moment. I had a framework for it, but then when I was there, I was like changing it. Some of the sanctuaries, even smaller ones, cost like 200 to 300,000 US a year to run, and they're nonprofits. And then I looked at like the conservation impact. So if they are like specifically reintroducing, for example, like critically endangered spider monkeys or squirrel monkeys, then they had a higher score than if they were reintroducing like howler monkeys and capuchins. And then I looked at like, does the sanctuary contribute to the community, which was part of me interviewing local folks to see, do you even know it exists? Do you know it's around? Like, do they come to schools? And do they like plant trees? How are they involved in like conservation, like proactively? This is Costa Rica. These are the sites I visited, and the ones that are pink are the ones I did like as focal sites, and I stayed at for like multiple weeks at a time. 4 and 6, which are the only 2 sanctuaries in Costa Rica that are like accredited by the Sanctuary Federation. Here's what the fieldwork looked like. I had a side shave at the time, if you're wondering who that is. So that's what it all looked like. Interviews, the survey, document review. I've got more pictures of that. Here's 3 capuchin enclosures, site 1, 2, and 3. All of these 3 sanctuaries that I studied had positive conservation and welfare scores, and site 2 had the highest. But the scores were all pretty close. These are the 2 sites that are accredited. This is the capuchin enclosure, and then this is like open air, which I've only ever seen at this one. And these are both sanctuaries that have been like funded by some rich European benefactor since like the 60s. So these are like established sanctuaries, and they're able to have that accreditation, and they have like the resources they need to have this level. This open air like capuchin situation wouldn't work everywhere. Here's what I figured vet students, you might be interested in what like the documents look like. And often the information would be like found like dead on side of road, and like around here, like brought in by so-and-so. And then this would be like their medical record. So a lot of this stuff is on paper about when they're getting medication. These are like the food that they're eating, mostly fruit. When I talked to a Costa Rican biologist, they kind of like sniffed when I showed them that. They're like, they're gonna get diabetes. That's another thing to think about too. But what's being donated? Fruit and veggies, right? So again, like the realities of being in a sanctuary. And then enrichment calendars. So ideally, like they're having enrichment multiple times a week, and with primates, as you probably know, like you need to change it out, make it complex and interesting. Here's the results of my assessment, which is easier to understand like this. This was like a format for graph that I took from like lab animals. It was like tourism events used to be like procedure, like severity. So I changed it to tourism events, but basically physical health, good environment, mental experiences, and tourism. And the site 2, you can see is like the broadest, but everyone's pretty close. And it had the least amount of tourists. Like I had like 6 a week, whereas site 3 had like 4 a day, 6 days a week. So yeah, it made a huge difference. The animals were just so chill at site 2. And then this is their conservation impact over their welfare score. Again, not necessarily saying like they're not doing enough, but just like certain, like site 2 had critically endangered species, 2 of them. Whereas site 1 is like in the north, surrounded by farm area, they only have ranging capuchins and howlers. So it's based also on the range of the animals. I took 365 documents from like those pieces of paper. And I got some from another site as well, because they actually had like records that were ready to go in Excel. And I found that like the major specific threat to monkeys is electrocution. And this has not changed in like the 5 years since I've been there. Most of the electrical wiring in Costa Rica is uninsulated. Like when I was there in 2019, they said it was like over 90%. And there's such rapid development, and they're not legally required to insulate it, although they're trying to change it now, that it's indistinguishable sometimes from like the trees. And if you're an arboreal species, it's, you know, you end up with these situations. So basically this like campaign came out, I think this past year. This isn't pura vida. Pura vida is like the Costa Rican catchphrase, meaning like pure life, like everything's good. And here they're saying, no, this isn't like good. This isn't like pure life. And then these images of electrocution, these are like the ones I can like stomach to like look at for more than a second. But if you're interested like clinically in what electrocuted animals look like and the severity of it, it's like very, very, very upsetting. It's emotionally taxing. There's a lot of compassion fatigue. So Costa Rica has this like campaign going out to try and put pressure on the electrical company, because there's like one electrical company basically that is like the head honcho. It's kind of like if Rogers was the only one in Canada, and they're the ones putting up these power lines. So another way that's like a reactionary thing, but like a necessary thing, is putting up these monkey bridges, and there has to be two because the monkeys need to use the tail, right, to cross on the top one. You can see the baby there. The numbers here don't even necessarily, like here you can see like fell from height, like hit by car, unknown, found injured. Like those are vague because that's what it said on like the sheet when they were rescued, but all of these could also be related to electrocution. If anyone's interested in like studying dogs, they have found canine distemper in like wild felines and in monkeys as well in Costa Rica. So these monkey bridges are like basically wildlife corridors, and often when you donate to a sanctuary, that's what you're funding, which is really great. So main findings, applying these like animal geography lenses to wildlife tourism is revealing that we need to care about the individuals. We need to care about as well as them as a whole. So it's like holding these two things that are really hard to marry, conservation and the group and individuals and welfare, and putting it together and seeing how they influence the sustainability of the attraction. And also considering animals as having a right to have a voice, however we find that voice, figure it out, asking animals how they feel is a lot of animal welfare, right? And what a good like life looks like for them, if they'd rather be left alone, if like most of the world, the reality is that we can't just, wild animals unfortunately can't just like roam around now without coming across some human interference or whatever. So how can we give them as much autonomy as possible if we can? And then looking at the kind of work monkeys do, which I didn't talk about as much in this one, but basically I'm like, they're educators, they're entertainers, they're doing emotional labor. Like there's like big brother, like older monkeys that are taking care of like the babies, and it's like unnatural, what do you call it, like unnatural social groupings, right? Because these are animals that are being brought and rescued, so it's like it's a found family. Very interesting kind of work, and I do see that monkeys as doing that work in tandem with the caregivers. And then looking at sanctuary sustainability showed that in Costa Rica, they are providing positive animal welfare and conservation outcomes where I was looking. And so we have these sort of in situ insights, whereas the research that inspired this was all mostly ex situ, so not done in person. And these are signs I took when I was back in 2025 that show like informational things, like don't take pictures with them, like you can have like a respectful wildlife selfie, but generally you want to stay like a meter away from the enclosure. And then explaining why often, right, because zoonosis, because of all these different reasons. And then like identifying the individuals as well and where they come from. Like they're not like glossing over things. Like often when I talk to tourists, they're like, that was like a very sobering experience. Like I'm gonna cry. A lot of folks were like, I got a lot from it. Like it's a hospice for wildlife. They're not being bred in captivity. A veterinarian told me like, you're not gonna be able to capture a monkey unless it's like on death's door, right? Like if they're coming, it's because they have a huge parasite load, so they like were on the ground or someone was able to pick them up. So oftentimes it's truly like kind of doing like hospice tourism, which is like a weird thing to think about, but it's also extremely educational. I looked at these like trade-offs that we talked about and like the hard choices that sanctuaries need to make. I looked at how like these sanctuaries are shaping the outcomes for the wildlife. I then like shared this information with the sanctuaries, and I like still continue to talk to them. So if anyone's interested in doing research with wildlife sanctuaries in Costa Rica or meeting wildlife veterinarians, I'm happy to connect you as well. And I created this like framework. There was no standardization for taking care of wildlife in captivity, like at all, not even food. So I tried to create one that most can use as like a general way to, like a framework to ensure that they're doing well for their monkeys, but it could be adapted for other animals as well. When I went back in 2025, they moved these capuchins. There were like 5 in this little spot. These are the ones that took my glasses. And then they moved. I have this like terrible, but it's like this is a like way taller and larger space. And now they're chilling and they're at the back, whereas before they were like pinballs like this. And then this was site 3, so they moved them from here, and this is like farther back, and like you can't get close. Like this is like where you can go to see the capuchins. Okay, so we talked about like the takeaways, more protocols, more understanding, more evidence, broad strokes, like our psychological biases, like sharing information and like what you learned, and that we shouldn't take selfies with wild animals. It's really hard when you work with animals too. There are publications that came out of this work. There's the monkey here, Mango, howler monkey. So we took him to the vet, and so that's why I'm not wearing PPE. Yeah, so that's the context, but that's not going on Instagram or anything, because people are just going to be like, this is a wildlife selfie. But yeah, got to take him to the vet. He's very sweet. And yeah, here's my Costa Rica monkey interest group that I created to connect people. This is like my website in that group if you scan it. Thank you to my funders and the 2 universities that this spanned and the Ministry of the Environment in Costa Rica. And yeah, that's everything. Thank you for listening.